Hello and welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I will integrate H2 in our Spring Boot application. If you don't know about H2, I created I think 3 or 4 videos before this one in this Spring Boot series just to explain this H2 database and how great it is that we can have a database in memory working like a database and even compatible with other databases. Please look into those videos if you don't know about this database. In this video, I will expect that you already know what is this database, so we'll see how to integrate it in our Spring Boot. So the first thing that we should do, of course, is going to our Maven file, POM, and add the dependency for the H2 database, similar to any other Java project, but we should also add this dependency. This dependency is not about H2, it's about to explain to Spring that you want to access database using JDBC. And behind the scenes, Spring will manage connections, data source. He has a lot of frameworks that we can use to access database. In this example, I will use the standard one. Then in other videos, I'll explain the JDBC client, JDBC template, Hibernate, and other frameworks that you can use, and JPA repositories, for instance. At least I remember these 4 by heart. So there are a lot of them, and I'll explain all of them progressively so you understand all of them, and then you can choose the best one for your project. But at the end of the day, this is JDBC with all these frameworks. And also probably, I don't know if it's inside of this or not, but Spring Boot out of the box already understands about H2, and I will prove you in a moment. So this is not the way for Spring understand H2 because this dependency is agnostic. If you create a Java project that is not a Spring, you should also add this dependency. But this one behind the scenes should understand a little bit about H2. So the first thing that you should do is just H2 configuration, and you can just copy paste this and probably it will be enough for most of your projects. Okay, you don't need all this configuration for H2, but I will explain in detail in a moment, so you will find out why I put all of this here. So this is the data source. Data source, it's the class responsible to, for instance, get connections. It's the configuration to access a data source. That's what the name is already saying it. In our case, it will be this data source. It is the H2 in memory, and the database, it's called usersDB. And it should use this driver. So this driver is provided, of course, by this dependency. The data source is managed by this one, and the driver it's here because driver it's not Spring related, it's just generic for JDBC and can be used in any project. So, and then of course the how to access or authenticate on this data source, and as you know, the H2 use SCA by default for username and no password at all. And you can change it, but for in-memory database, I don't see the reason unless you are testing security. That will be a reason to change. Otherwise, there is no reason to change this username and password. Now, optionally, you can enable the web console, meaning that when our application is running, even with the database in memory, if you use this address in your browser, you can access a console to manage the database, like if it was a server running in a different machine. That's a great thing because the memory it's in the database, it's in memory, and you can access it as a server from outside, not inside our application. Of course, somehow it's inside of our application because the address would be the same, but you can use a browser, so you don't have to create nothing in your application to allow the access to database. If the database is there, it can be accessed by any browser. Okay, and then this is some initialization. So, but at the end of the day, these 4 properties should be enough for you to use H2. This allows us to access using web console. This one will allow us to create or automate script execution when the application is starting. In this case, we are saying, okay, we are using the platform H2, and we have these 2 files that we created here, data and schema, okay, that we want to be executed at the start of the application. And it should always execute them. Because there are ways for you to say, okay, execute one time, but then don't execute in the next execution, things like that. There's some configurations, if you look into the documentation, that you can change. But in our case, it will be used always, so it will always work, let's say like that. So what are the purpose of these files? Let's see, the schema SQL. You can put the name as that you wish. It's not mandatory to be named schema, but it's a schema, so it's our create table. So we are creating a table for users, okay, with ID, username, password, name, email, the common stuff for this kind of tables. And then I created a file named data that just executes to inserts. So you can understand that you can create boot scenarios using H2, meaning that when the application starts, Spring Boot automatically will look for these files, okay, that you write here. You can see that it's in plural. You can put more than one file and just execute them. So you can initialize your database with data for testing purpose or other kind of scenarios that you think are useful for you. So this is the configuration. So at the end of the day, this one should always exist. This one, it's for web access, and this one is just if you want to initialize. But of course, you can, after getting a connection, create yourself a table and insert data using your application. This is just an optional way that can initialize the database. So again, now the implementation. So I create a repository in our 3-layer, and it's a user repository. I put this annotation. Again, I will explain more about this annotation in the future, but it could be component, as I explained it in a previous video, because all these annotations, and again, if you're looking this for the first time, you can see this annotation, it's a component annotation also. So if you want to use a component, it should work. But the repository, it's more appropriate since its purpose, it's to access a repository of data. And the Spring Boot, when it checks it is a repository, it can change a few internal things to act accordingly to a data access class and not a generic class. Let's say like that before entering into details. So as I explained before in a previous video, so when the application starts, Spring Boot will look for bins or class marked with annotations that T knows about it. It creates internally a graph of dependencies. And what I'm saying here is that the user repository needs a data source. And the data source, it's a class that Spring Boot understands. So you will look for a bin or a configuration that contains the data source. And if it finds it, it will create one and injects it here. So where is our data source? It's here. You can see here Spring data source. So this internally, Spring will take this. You will create a data source with this information, and later when we put the auto hire here and ask for a data source, it will be injected here, an instance of the data source, and we can just store it here in our class when this class is created. By the way, unless we say otherwise, all the classes annotated with Spring Boot annotations are singleton. Meaning that every time, since it is Spring creating this class, every time you do a request, it's the class that was created at first. There are ways to change this, which is called scopes, but it's a more advanced concept. In a future video, I will explain about it. But for now, consider it as a singleton, meaning that if you put a property here, this property, even if there are 10 different requests, if one of the requests changes that property, all the other requests will see the new value. So be careful with that. Consider the singleton if you are, for instance, a junior starting to develop as a kind of a static. It's not the same thing, but somehow it is. They are related concepts. Okay, so when this class is created, of course, we have a data source. Now to get users, just command JDBC. So we have our query to get users. And we use this data source, not the connection that we usually do, and we get a connection from it. Okay. Of course, you can also say, okay, should I put here the connection on the constructor? It's not a good idea because it will be the same connection for all the requests. So get the connection when you need it. Internally, there are pools and they will be recycled. So don't think much about it. That's one of the advantages to use frameworks is that they do things for us. Okay, so I create the statement for this connection, then I just execute user returning a result set, create the users, the class user here, and it just return the user. Okay, and the same for when I get user by ID. Again, a select with a parameter. Here, of course, use a prepared statement. In this case, it's just a statement because it's not parameterized, and it's the same. It's the same code. If you're using something like the JDBC template and other frameworks, maybe you can avoid some replication here, or duplication code here, not replication. Replication is a different concept. A duplication here, but for now, just simple code, just a few lines there is no problem about repeating. But if you look into this, sometimes they are the same, or the initializations are really almost equal. But Spring provides ways to avoid all this duplication of code. But at the end of the day, just a select where ID is something, and it will return one user or an optional empty if the user is not found. Okay, so who calls this user repository? Of course, user service. And again, the same concept we have here. To create the user service, which contains this annotation, it is necessary user repository. And again, you start to understand when Spring Boot will try to create user service, we look if it already has an instance of user repository. If it doesn't have, you'll create the user repository. To create the user repository, we look, okay, it needs a data source, so we look for a data source. Now it creates the data source. The data source will allow the creation of user repository, which will allow the creation of user service. Now you understand this dependency injection, so it depends of other class, and there is an inversion of control. We should wait until the latest one to check what is the, let's say, the dependency, the latest dependency created, and then we reverse the cascade until we can create the first component. In our case, it will be the user service. So when we have this instance of users repository, when someone calls the get user by ID, again, as I explained it before, here get user by ID, I'll just call user repository get user by ID. Usually I like to return an optional here when it's a unique value. So if I'm looking for a user and I can't find it, I use an optional, because returning null, it's quite strange. If I'm trying to find something and I don't find, I should return something called empty. Say, okay, I couldn't find nothing about it. So we have the optional empty. And this is one of the main reasons why Oracle created the optional and added to the Java. The same applies for here. If you look for users and there is no user, you shouldn't return null. Usually you'll return an empty list. So we should apply the same concept for the user. I should, let's say, return an empty user, not a user with empty fields, but an empty user. And an empty user, it's just an optional object that it's empty. Let's say like that. Okay, that's a good practice if you read about the optional, just to return that. In the service, I should have done the same, but I didn't want to complicate too much the code and introduce a lot of changes. But I put it here to do for a next video. Rather than returning user, I should return optional user. That's why here I'm getting the user, and if it's null, if it's empty, I'll return null. But of course, I should return again an optional empty. But just to let's say it was a way for me to explain you why I'm using optional, and you can see the difference. But of course, later I will put here an optional user. If you want, just add it. It is the correct way, and you will not need this part of the code. But at the end of the day, just user repository, getting the user by ID, and the same for get users, just call the user repository to get users. So we already have this business layer, which is called user service. We have our data layer with user repository, and of course we have the external database, which is in memory, which is represented by this data source. So we already have a service calling a repository, which by the way gets information from a data source, and in our case our data source, it's the H2. So now we have the REST, it's a web application, and we have a REST control. I removed from here the hello, so now we have the get user and users, and okay, let's change this. If I remove that, I should call these users. That makes more sense. It was our first REST controller, now it's called user REST controller, and again it needs the user service. So again, repeating a little bit, so when it tries to create this REST controller, Spring Boot, we look for a class registered in Spring Boot with the service for user service, and the user service, as we know, depends on the user repository, and user repository depends on the data source. So it will create the data source, which allowed Spring Boot to create this one, okay? Data source allows the creation of the repository, which allows the creation of the user service. That's our business layer, again, user repository. And now our REST can be created because we already have a user service that we can use here. So when someone goes to the browser and write users, it's not say goodbye, again, users, like this, and this meta user, so it will call the get users from user service and will return this list. When he's asking for a user, it will just call user ID. Of course, this is not the correct way. The correct way should be something like this. But I don't want to introduce this now. That's why I'm using this here. But I'll just put here to later use user's ID, something like that. Okay, that will be the most accurate way to develop this. So it will be different. But let's put here the to-do and we'll change later. So we get user and get user ID. So we have a way to test both methods that we have in our service, which corresponds to other two methods that we have in our repository that we'll get for our database. So what we expect to return, remember that in our schema we have this table here, and we have two rows that we expect to be there, users, user 1 and user 2. Okay, and this is our application. I think I'm not forgetting nothing. If you understand this, and with this information, you can already develop a full implementation with a simple REST without knowing about parameters and things like that on the REST. But for simple things, you can already create a REST layer, a business layer, a data layer, and a database that you can use. I think it's a good start for any project. So with just a few codes, if you look into my previous videos, just simple code. And you can even say this is the code that I'm explaining here. It's just, it is this code. There is nothing else that we need to have a web server executing this. So let's execute this. Probably I already talked too much. I like to explain things in detail. I like people to remember the things and just say pass my mindset, so people understand how to think. I think it's it's better to understand how to think than to just know stuff, because if you understand how to think about something, you will reach quite fast to the solution. That's why I talk too much, or maybe I really like to talk. Okay, let's run the application. Okay, after those changes, I expect nothing to break. Let's see the output. It's always good for you to understand this output, at least when if there is something not working. Everything gets the info, which is a good start. There is no exceptions here. So we can see that we have the application Tomcat here. It's our web server running on port 8080. Okay, it's a servlet engine. Now the embedded web application context is initializing without problems at localhost / this is our application here. Which is a good thing also, because it's the web application context is related with our application. That's where it will be executed. Now you have the root web application here. Okay, it's not important. Now you can see that the H2 console, meaning the web access, was allowed in our application, meaning that if we write, and you can see that it's ours because you can see it here. If you read all this line, H2 console available at, and the database is available also. So it created our database and initialized it correctly. Okay, and Tomcat started here. Okay, and it is running. So let's see if that's true or not. Let's see here. So this is our application 8080. This is not an error. You can see that this application has no explicitly mapping for this. So you are seeing this as a fallback. It's not that something is wrong. It's not a 500, it's just a 404, meaning I couldn't find the web page. Of course, because we didn't provide one, and this is not the web page, but we provided, for instance, users. And we can, when you execute user, you can see the return in JSON, our list, you can see from this symbol, and our two users, the ID 1 here in JSON, and the ID 2. So it was getting this from the database. And if you write user like this, we can see it got the user 1 because it was the one that we wrote in the code. Of course, later we will see how can we do something like this. It will be more correct, let's say. So our two REST are working, our service is responding, our data layer is responding, and our database contains all the data. So there is one more thing to do, which is checking the H2 console. Let's see if we can. The application is running. Can we look into the database? Yes, we can. So we have here, make sure that this is what you have written in your, remember this is JDBC URL, and JDBC in H2 is JDBC, the name of the driver, the mode, let's say like this, it's memory, and this is database, the default username, password. If you look into these 4 parameters, okay, and you look into your data source, application properties, that's the same configuration, okay? This configuration, of course, this is a way for Spring to understand data source, but these 4 values are really important for any database, even outside the Spring. Okay, so let's connect. And you can see don't expect nothing too much professional here, but you can see that there is users here. This is our database. You have users, our table. And when you click, if you expand, you can see the attributes. You can even have index. If you want to know more about this database, look into my previous videos. It's a really advanced database. But you have this query that you can run. And you can see you have 2 users, and you can write whatever you want. Where, let's say, user 1, or where user name equals, for instance, user 2. And when we run, you can see the results. So you can make tests about your code. You can even change here. Let's say you do something like insert into, I'll just do an update. I don't want to update users, so we don't take too much time here. Set username equals to, let's say, user222, where ID equals 2. We just run. And let's see what happened to our code here. So remember that the server is still running. Now I'll just put on the side localhost and put here users. And you can see the user name was changed. So you even can, let's say, debug, troubleshoot, and change values to adapt your application that it's running. Maybe this application is being tested and you create a set of scripts, and now you want to change some values to check why something is failing, why something is not returning what you expect, or maybe there was a mistake in the SQL script and you want to change it before really changing to check if it works or not, and that's a good way to do it. So I hope you now understand how to integrate H2 and why I love so much about this database when I'm developing server boot applications. So thank you for watching, and expect more from my side regarding Spring Boot.